this is Marty. I'm with Puddle Glum's Music Collection. I'm going to talk about Jesus Revolution, the movie coming up, but I'm not really going to talk about that. I'm talking about the Jesus Revolution or Jesus Movement or Jesus Freaks or, you know, street evangelism preachers at the time. There's all sorts of names they had for the Jesus Movement, or as the movie calls it, the Jesus Revolution, which is going back to the basics of what happened in Southern California when the Jesus Movement was starting with Calvary Chapel, and all those groups and the movement that started. I haven't seen the movie. The movie is February 22nd. I'm going to see it then, so we're going to do this till February 22nd. Go through the different music genres and different things that happened in the Jesus Movement. But I'd like to go through different bands so you know what bands came out of the Jesus Movement that started the whole contemporary Christian music genre. But at that time, Christian music was different because it was all about the Jesus Movement. Bands weren't out there to get famous. Bands weren't out there to make money. Bands were out there to evangelize either to the unsaved, which is basically what they were trying to do, or to the saved and encourage them. So, Jesus Movement, I grew up kind of in that. I was young at the time, but my sisters were in the Jesus Movement. I remember going into my sister's room at a young age, seeing a Larry Norman album, which is, he's considered the grandfather of Christian rock, but there were a lot of other people before him, and, different people were making different avenues in that area. So I'm just talking about it all. I'm going to miss some people because the Jesus Movement was very large in different parts of the country at the same time. A lot of people, this is underground, a lot of people didn't know about it, and I'm glad this movie's coming out to kind of show some of the things going on. This movie is going to have Chuck talk about Pastor Chuck from Calvary Chapel. It's going to talk about Lonnie Frisbee. It's going to talk about, a lot of different people in that era that started the Jesus Movement, especially in California. It'll be interesting how they go about it. I know Lonnie Frisbee had a lot of stuff in his past. Later on, repented for it and kind of fixed the ties between him and Chuck and and everybody in that area in the Vineyard, which was an offshoot of Calvary Chapel that Lonnie Frisbee went and started. He was not a perfect man. He had problems just like most Christians do when they start looking at themselves and not at Christ. But it'll be interesting to see how it goes, and it'll be a great movie to bring this about because a lot of people, especially nowadays, don't remember the Jesus Movement or they weren't aware of it at the time for some reason. Time Magazine came out with the big cover, Jesus Revolution, which is what this movie took the name from. Jesus Movement was on Life Magazine. And then, you had other people, you had songs like from Elton John talking about the Jesus Freaks and different other bands that would discuss it. You had the Doobie Brothers coming out with songs like Jesus Is All Right With Me. And, different groups that were saying things, that were kind of coming from that area of the Jesus Movement. So, this is starting in California, though, this movie, late 60s, early 70s. So we're going to go through different music for those times. Right now I'm looking at a band called Calvary Chapel. There was a lot of different movements. This was in Southern California. There was stuff going on in the UK. There was stuff going on in the Midwest. There was stuff going on, up the coast, from California and Oregon. And there was stuff going on everywhere at this time because a lot of the hippies that were disillusioned by drugs and free sex and all that stuff were looking for answers. And a lot of these people went to Middle Eastern things like the Beatles, with George Harrison went into Middle Eastern things. Everybody's looking for an answer, and a lot of these hippies found the answer in Christ, in Jesus. But a lot of the churches would not let them in because of how they looked or the kind of music they were playing. But Chuck Smith, which was the pastor of Calvary Chapel, eventually let them in and, discipled them, and they went out and evangelized, and it became this big thing. If you looked at, Larry Norman was one of the catapults of it, came from the band People. Larry Norman, was actually on Capitol and Verve and talking about Jesus. And so he was what considered one of the big names of the time because he started out on those labels, and he was talking about Jesus and Christianity, and biblical principles and things like that. You had other groups that were kind of, coming from independent labels and things, bands that were like the psychedelic kind of Hendrix Cream sounding Excursions. You had Glass Harp with Phil Keaggy, who was talking about more Christian things and later on became a Christian in the early 70s. So Glass Harp was exploring all these Christian things. So an Ohio-based band that was playing along with the James Gang and, all those bands with this great guitar player who eventually went solely into Christian music. You had bands like Moonblood. You had bands like Agape that was doing kind of a Hendrix thing that were a little heavier. And then you had a bunch of country rock bands. You had you had the Love Song from Calvary Chapel. You had the Mason Prophet with the Talbot brothers, John and Michael Talbot, that were offshooting from that, doing more Christian spiritual lyrics as they became more exploring into Christianity. Mason Prophet was a country rock band that came from, that the Eagles cite as one of their influences. Then you had Richie Furay, that was from Buffalo Springfield, and Poco, and Rock and Roll Hall of Famer. All of a sudden he was, talking about Jesus, and he eventually became a Calvary Chapel pastor. So you had a lot of things going on in these areas. You had Michael Omartian, that was a big producer that was doing Christian music and talking about Christ. And so there's all these, in the secular music and in the, and in the Christian music, the quartet, like the Imperials that mostly did gospel and everything, were coming out acting, enforcing this Jesus movement thing, Johnny Cash, all these things. So today I'm going to talk about the music through this series of different bands, and I'm going to miss some because there's so many different genres. But today I'm going to talk about Love Song, which was one of the first bands of Calvary Chapel that came out and put out albums. I guess they were real huge in the Philippines because one of their songs took off, and they always tell that story about going to the Philippines and coming out of the plane, and they're like the Beatles, and they were kind of chuckling about all that. Some mission people brought them over. Calvary Chapel would bring in these hippies and things to try to help them, get them off drugs, and they were all people interested in the Bible. Love Song were reading the Bible before that, and they were looking at all sorts of things for their spiritual fulfillment. But when they came to Calvary Chapel, they ended up accepting Christ, and they became one of Calvary Chapel's main bands. They put out albums, and they had a kind of a worship, but a folky and country rock feel to them. And they became one of the staples of the Jesus movement. I'll show you a couple albums here. See here, this is their first album, I think, just called Love Song. If you haven't checked them out, check them out. They got Chuck Girard, Jay Truo. Here we go. So this is this one here. And let's see which label this is. It should be on this is Good News label, right before Maranatha came out with their own label. Maranatha was part of Calvary Chapel label, and they brought out all sorts of different bands to listen to, but this is Love Song. And let's see who we got here. We got Chuck Girard, of course. This early incarnation of Tom Coombs, Jay Truax, or Truax. I never know how to say that. I should look it up. And Bob Wall. We also had Fred Field involved in this band. Phil Keaggy was in it for a while. Fletch Wiley was in it for a while. So we had different people coming in on this band. But basically it was these guys here. And this is Feel the Love. This is a live album they did a little later. Had all their hits from the two albums on here. It's a big album here. And this is a really good live album if you can ever get a look at it and find it. It's a double live album, and it's really good. They were a very good band, and Chuck Girard went on to do his own solo stuff. So did Tommy Coombs. All these guys play, and a lot of these. John Mailer also had a solo album out that was very good. The drummer, yeah, John Mailer was a great drummer, and he had a solo album out also. And Chuck Girard had many solo albums out, and Tommy Coombs had a few. And they all went into different parts of the Christian music industry, quite a few of them. Yeah, so they were a country rock band, but they also did a lot of worship and a lot of folk songs, kind of. But they were one of the main bands of Calvary Chapel. Calvary Chapel brought out a lot of other bands too. You know, they're the ones that Daniel Amos came from there. Sweet Comfort Band. So there was a lot of different groups. Mustard Seed Faith, Gentle Faith, which spewed Odin Fong, which brought out Daryl Mansfield out of those bands. These are a lot of guys that were big in the Christian music industry. Of course, Daryl Mansfield being in the Blues Rock Hall of Fame, and then there's and I'm going to go over all those different bands with you during these sessions. Uh, a love song, became a very big part of Calvary Chapel. Um, and they did a lot of concerts at Calvary Chapel, and they were on Calvary Chapel's label. But the first one was on Good News Records. And, and some people came in and out of the band. But it's a good band if you look them up and listen to some of their songs. A lot of their songs I really liked from this band were Little Country Church, Front Seat, Back Seat, the Cossack song. There's some of the more rockier country type rock songs. I love songs a little more mellow. Feel the Loves, Worship. Since I opened up the doors, a little more contemporary. There's also a drum solo on this live album that's really good from John Mailer. So, yeah, so that's Love Song. They had, I think they had, they did an album a little later with some different guys. Like I said, Phil Keaggy played with them on a tour and did a few things with them too. Phil Keaggy from the band Glass Harp in the Midwest. So check them out. That's Calvary Chapel's band Love Song. Calvary Chapel is still going on, and it has a lot of different churches and offshoots. And so did the Vineyard, who came off of Calvary Chapel. But also in the series, I'm going to go through different areas. The Midwest had their Jesus People, which I was a part of for half my life. Jesus People USA came from Jesus People Milwaukee, who had offshoots, overseas with the sheep. Helped start Greenbelt Festival. They had Jesus People USA had Servant come out of that, or Milwaukee had Servant come out of that community, a band called Servant, and they also had the Resurrection Band, Res Band, which was the more popular of the groups, and they came from Jesus People USA, which was an offshoot of Jesus Milwaukee. So, you had all that, and then in the Midwest, you had bands like Petra that started in the early 70s, and you had bands like, Glass Harp with Phil Keaggy, and then you had groups like Paul Clark. So you had stuff going on all over, and overseas you had all sorts of crazy stuff. You had Out of Darkness, you had the Barrett Band, you had, and then of course you had your big main people like Larry Norman, and then he had Larry Norman in California, had Randy Stonehill, and you had Larry Norman, Randy Stonehill, Mark Hurd, and it could go on and on. But Jesus People just brought forth birth for all these things. And I'm going to try to go over the different bands with you here. So that first one today is Love Song. And check those guys out. And if you want to look up Jesus Movement online, take a look at it before Jesus Revolution comes out on February 22nd. That talks about the birth of that in California. But yeah, we had a lot of people involved. Dwayne Peterson was one of them. They had a lot of Jesus papers out then. The Hollywood Free Paper was Jesus. Then they had Cornerstone out in the Midwest. They had, they had a lot of different papers out at the time that they would pass out and tell people about the Lord. There's some bad things that came out of it. I mean, there were a lot of communities that came out of it, but then there was people like Children of God that were more of a cult that came out of that. So you had a lot of stuff coming out, but then you had things like Campus Crusade for Christ, which was a cool thing. You had all these different things coming out of the Jesus movement with people that were just looking for answers that came from that hippie movement and didn't find anything there. But a lot of people early, Janis Joplin, they saw all these people dying, and they were just looking for answers. So we're going to go over those bands over this week. And this Love Song was the first one. Check them out online. Thanks. Thanks for joining Puddleglum's Music Collection. You have a good day.